We welcome in our man, Nick Wagoner, the writer for ESPN, covers the 49ers. He's also the protector of all things Bay Area hip hop.
Hey.
Nick, appreciate you, my man. Is this Jimmy situation surprising at all?
I don't think it's surprising, Damien, and good to be with you guys. I think the thing that would maybe come surprising is the shoulder surgery, and I only say that in the sense that nobody involved in this thought he was going to have to get it after the season. But it's not surprising in this sense, guys, and we could talk about this further, but, what people ask all the time or say all the time, like, well, they're mad at the 49ers for this. They want to blame the 49ers for this. And I kind of push back on the idea that, they could have traded him this offseason because of the shoulder and because of, there were other better quarterbacks available that teams were going to pursue first. But if you want to assign blame, if you want to look at this and say, what is the thing that the Niners should have been able to foresee that now they have to kind of eat, is keeping him last year. Because you right now are in a situation with Jimmy Garoppolo, who is an often injured quarterback. Let's just call it what it is. That has been the case in his career as a starter, that he has been injured more often than a lot of other starters are. And so you were betting last year, the risk you took by keeping him was he's going to stay healthy, he's going to play well, and his trade value is going to get back to a point where we're going to be able to get something good for him in the offseason. And they almost got there, guys, but they didn't quite make it. He got hurt, and now you're in a position where you're trying to trade an often injured quarterback who, guess what, is injured again.
Nick, I know the optics of it looks a little wild and makes it look like, they weren't prepared for this, or it might even just be a bad look. But I think about it, I don't know if it's the worst thing in the world if they have to bring Jimmy back, and I don't think he's starting, but if he was on the roster, like it's not the end of the world to have Jimmy Garoppolo as your backup quarterback, at least for this upcoming season.
Yeah, here's the thing, and we're still a long way away from that coming true, right? There's still a lot of things that could still play out. There's a lot of time. There's injuries that could happen other places. Jimmy has to get healthy, and so I think we're in a little bit of a holding pattern right here, right now. It is still, even after everything I heard when I was in Florida this week from Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch and even Jed York, it is still very hard for me to envision a scenario in which Jimmy Garoppolo is back on the roster, especially at his current cap number. Now, I never say never when it comes to anything in the NFL, because I've been doing this for too long and seen too much crazy stuff happen to rule anything out. But I just think it would be really difficult to bring him back and then have the situation where you are going to be the backup at that price tag. Then the conversation would turn if it was, hey, we're just going to have to release you, or we're going to bring you back as a backup, but it's going to have to be at a significantly reduced price. And that would give Jimmy Garoppolo the power for the first real time in this whole scenario to say, okay, what are my options? If his goal is to be a starter this coming season, those options have already dwindled quite a bit, guys. There's not really a lot of options out there. I mean, you can look at Seattle or you can look at Carolina. Seattle is only going to happen most likely, and again, never say never, but only going to happen most likely in the event that he were to be released and signed there. Carolina, from my understanding and from poking around on it this week, I think one of the things that's really holding them back is they have Sam Darnold at a guaranteed price of something like $18 million this year, and so they have a contract that they can't unload. So they're not going to want to necessarily bring Garoppolo in at his current price via a trade. So maybe he could go there and start. But he may end up being in a position where he has to look at the landscape and say, I got to be a backup for this year. What can I do to put myself in a position where I can be a starter for someone next year? And I know he's a lot younger, but maybe follow kind of what Mitchell Trubisky just did, where he went to Buffalo, was in a good system for a year, didn't really play, so nobody knows if he got better, actually. But he was better by the fact that he didn't play in some sense. And a team would be willing to roll the dice on him that way. So, again, I never say never. I still think it's pretty hard to believe he'll be back at all. I think it's really hard to believe that he'll be back at his current price tag still.
Man, first of all, shout out to Sam Darnold's agent. Second, man, we're equating Jimmy Garoppolo. We're asking Jimmy Garoppolo to follow Mitchell Trubisky's game plan right now. Like that's, man, that's tough. From a 49ers perspective, Nick, if they have to release him, is it really that big of a deal? Now that they couldn't trade him and kind of free agency is come and gone, whatever happens next, is it that big of a deal?
Yeah, no, it's not. And again, like, it would just be an admittance of the risk that I was just talking about. The thing with the injury that they rolled that dice because they knew there was a real possibility Jimmy Garoppolo was going to get hurt again. And so they weren't surprised when he did. And the reason that they went out and got Trey Lance was largely because of that, right? So they weren't caught off guard by that part of the equation. But I don't think that it's a huge deal. I know people would be upset, right, if they were to just release him after all this and say, well, why didn't you do that earlier? You could have gone out and got Chandler Jones, or you could have got Tyrann Mathieu. I'm just going to tell you guys, they weren't going to do that. Even if they had gotten rid of Jimmy Garoppolo, they weren't going to do that. That's not the way they were thinking going into this offseason. They have signed a number of guys at the top end of their position groups over the years, and they got 2 more coming. So you've already got Trent Williams, Fred Warner, George Kittle, Eric Armstead, all these guys making really top-of-the-market money for their positions, and they're going to do it with Deebo Samuel and Nick Bosa too, or at least that is their current objective. So they weren't going to go sign a high-end guy. But what they did was they said, we're going to invest our resources this offseason into one big bite of the apple, and we're going to do it at a premium position. We're not going to pay $13 million for a guard. They're going to pay $14 million a year for a corner, which makes sense to me, right? Like that's a thing that makes a lot of sense because cornerback is a higher value position. They have draft picks that they can invest in other things. And the other thing that nobody really talks about here, guys, is when you look at what their plan was for this offseason and what they're doing moving forward, those compensatory picks that they keep getting, now some of the coaching stuff, not necessarily by design, but has worked out well for them, but they're letting guys like Laken Tomlinson and DJ Jones go, knowing that there's going to be a payback for that on the other end in the form of a compensatory pick. And so they know that they can stack picks more that way. I think the Baltimore Ravens have done that better than any other team in the league, and you always wonder on day 2, like, why are the Ravens drafting every 5 seconds? Like, that's why, because they do that. So I think that's all part of the equation. But in terms of Garoppolo himself, that salary, I think they would have loved to have gotten it off the books so they didn't have to restructure Eric Armstead and George Kittle. They could have done those on a case-by-case basis rather than doing it all at once. But either way, I think they were going to have to do all the stuff that they've done this offseason, and it's played out pretty much how they expected.
See, like I keep telling you guys, man, me and Nick, we understand, like, it's not that big of a deal. Don't listen to the media. Only listen to Nick, right? Because he's going to give you that real. All right? I keep trying to tell you guys. We calm down. Hey, Nick, real quick.
I'll remember that when you're overreacting to something in week 3, by the way. I'll remember that.
Hey, Nick, I wanted to ask you something else about Jimmy Garoppolo here. And has the NFL as a whole told everybody what they think about Jimmy Garoppolo and think that he's not really a starter anyway because there's nobody really clamoring to get him? Or is it all circumstantial? Like you mentioned with Carolina. I mean, Carolina may look at him like, hey, we would take Jimmy, but we've got this $18 million with, Sam Darnold that we just can't take on. But is Jimmy looked at as a legit NFL starter that can, help lead your franchise? Or is he looked at as more of a system quarterback, i.e. just a Kyle Shanahan system quarterback?
It's a great question, and it's kind of the part that gets lost in all this because I think it probably ranks 3rd when you're getting up on the podium and handing out the medals on reasons why Jimmy Garoppolo is still a 49er. I think number 1 is simply there were better quarterbacks that became available. Some that you knew were going to be available, some, like a Matt Ryan that you didn't necessarily know was going to be available. Those types of things. Number 2 is the shoulder, the injury issue. But number 3 is what you're hitting at right here. And I wrote this a couple weeks ago. And when I was talking to people from other teams, sources from other teams around the league, trying to get a gauge on what the price for Jimmy Garoppolo might be, or even if they were going to be able to trade him, the one thing that came up from multiple teams and multiple people was, has he reached his ceiling? Is he at his limit? Because there's not a ton of self-awareness when it comes to these coaches in this league, right? A lot of these guys think that they are able to fix whatever is broken with a certain player if there's a talented guy or whatever. But everyone also knows that Kyle Shanahan is one of the absolute best in the business at what he does. And so if they're sitting there and they're saying Kyle Shanahan is getting rid of this guy, and yes, there's injuries involved, and that is a big part of this, but he's getting rid of him. What can I do? How am I going to get more out of him? It's not like he's a young guy anymore. Now, he hasn't played a lot of football, which is crazy if you look at it. I think he hasn't even started 50 games in his career, which is nuts for a guy his age. But he's in his 30s now. He's at 30 years old. So I think a lot of people view it as he's probably at his ceiling. And let's use Pittsburgh as the example. I think a lot of that was the fact that the Steelers, just kind of the way they've always done business, they weren't going to give up a premium pick, and they didn't necessarily want to pay Jimmy Garoppolo's salary. But if they could get a guy who's younger at a fraction of the cost of what Jimmy Garoppolo's at and not have to give up compensation to get him, they're going to roll the dice on that upside saying, we think we can get more out of him. And maybe the peak of that guy is what Jimmy Garoppolo was at his best, but they would still be getting it at a bargain compared to what they would have got if they got Jimmy Garoppolo.
Nick, you're the man, brother. We appreciate you. Thanks for carving out some time for us.
You got it, guys. Anytime. Take care.
Thanks.